When it comes to supporting migrant women affected by trafficking and violence, by and for services are essential. These are organisations led by and for the communities that they serve. They bring cultural understanding, shared experience, and deep-rooted trust that mainstream services often lack. In this episode, I speak with Dolores Modern, an exploitation and trafficking policy manager at the Latin American Women's Rights Service, known as LAWRS. They are a by and for organisation that supports Latin American migrant women across the UK. Dolores shares how their work responds directly to the needs of the women they support and why culturally grounded, trauma-informed advocacy is so crucial in a hostile environment. We also explore the intersections between trafficking, violence against women and girls, and harmful practice, and the way in which many women fall through the gaps. So tell me a little bit about LAWRS and your role here.
LAWRS is by and for organization, also a feminist and human rights organization. Being by and for means that we are Latin American women supporting Latin American women living here in the UK. We offer a range of frontline services, including support for victims or survivors of domestic abuse, as well as for survivors of exploitation, trafficking, modern slavery. We offer legal advice on immigration, family law, employment rights. We offer support for women who need to access benefits or housing, among other services. Our policy work focuses on two main areas. One is violence against women and girls. The other one is modern slavery, which is what I do. And of course, those are issues that intersect not only with each other, but with many other issues like immigration, like housing, etc. And so, that last one is what I do. I'm policy manager on labor, policy and communications manager on labor exploitation.
And how did you come into this work? What sort of inspired you to do it? And how did you start at LAWRS?
I did my master's in human rights, but already knowing that what I was most interested in was modern slavery. And then pretty much as soon as I came to the UK, I think the year after, I started volunteering with LAWRS. And I found that it was an organization that was sort of dealing with all the issues that I was interested in, immigration, social justice, modern slavery, gender. It ticked all the boxes for me. And so I stayed as a volunteer for many years until this position opened up. And I'm very, very lucky that they took me. And I've learned so much doing it. And I love working in an organization that allows me to work alongside my community and also for my community.
And how do abuse and exploitation uniquely impact the women that you work with compared to, say, the wider population in the UK?
I think it's an issue of the intersection of circumstances and characteristics of the women we support. Latin American women tend to come here and experience from the start a set of barriers. One of them is that they normally don't speak a lot of English, and then very often they have degrees, qualifications back home that aren't recognized here. The system is so complex here in the UK, for example, that women who have access to or who would have access to benefits or housing aren't actually accessing those because they don't know how to. And then that leads very often to downward occupational mobility. That's very common in our community. And many women, or I would say most women, end up working in three sectors, mainly cleaning, hospitality, and domestic work, where they experience in-work poverty. And what I always sort of explain about these sectors is that they create a vicious cycle in a way, because you end up in one of these jobs because of your circumstances, but these jobs don't allow you to exit or change those circumstances because you don't have the time or money to upskill, retrain, learn English, or do whatever you want to do to have a different job, a different life, or a job that matches your skills or qualifications. And I think that makes women very vulnerable.
In what ways can intimate partners or family members be perpetrators of trafficking or exploitation? And how does this complicate definitions of domestic abuse from your perspective?
I love this question. I don't think it needs to complicate the definition. I think that speaks to our sort of need to have very set and clear-cut definitions that don't always match reality, I guess, or not that perfectly. And very often we have cases that are only domestic abuse and cases that are only trafficking or exploitation, but very often we also have cases that have, where one issue is both things. And the examples that come to mind are, for example, in cases of sexual exploitation, when a woman is dating what is called a Romeo perpetrator, who are the men who either begin a relationship or pretend to be in a relationship with a woman only to sexually exploit them later on. But it's also the case when a woman is in a relationship where the man forces her to work outside of the home but keeps all her earnings, and equally when she's forced to work inside the home with, not a real choice.
What are some signs that a case of domestic abuse might actually involve elements of trafficking or exploitation?
The first obvious sign would be the fact that the woman has been brought to the UK by the perpetrator or trafficker, and that can be by him paying for her ticket or convincing her to come, either with a job offer or the promise of a relationship, of marriage, of a visa. Very often they're brought here with the lie that here they're allowed to work, or here the partner will apply for the visa that they need when they know that they don't have the option really. But that in itself could be a case that's just domestic abuse. The other signs that you need to look for obviously are the fact that there is purpose of exploitation. So if once the woman gets here, she's sort of convinced or coerced to perform sexual acts with other men, and that's for a profit that the man keeps. Or, like we discussed earlier, if the woman is working outside of the home but the man is keeping all her earnings, if she doesn't have access to a bank account, either hers or shared with him, that sort of thing, those elements of control where profits are involved, earnings are involved, those are all signs.
And how does immigration control, particularly dependency on, say, a spousal visa, or for women with no recourse to public funds, trap migrant women in exploitative situations? What do you see at LAWRS?
When your visa depends on someone else, because you have, for example, a spouse visa or you're dependent on someone's student visa, then you always have that possibility of losing your status, and that's not up to you, that's up to the other person. But also with these visas, and this is really key, you have no recourse to public funds. You're subject to the no recourse to public funds rule, which essentially means that if you were in an abusive situation and you tried to leave, then you would find it very hard to access the support that you will need. And that, of course, makes a person very, very vulnerable, because you will always think twice. If you know that if you leave, you might end up in a worse situation than you're in at home, then that will make you think twice. And in the case of those who are undocumented, all of this applies, but it's even worse because you don't have the right to rent, you don't have the right to work, and so you're essentially left with no options. I think the really key thing about this is that all these immigration rules and laws are playing into the hands of abusers and exploiters and traffickers, because this is what they use as a threat. This is, when they are trying to keep someone from leaving, they will say, you are here illegally, so you won't be believed if you go to the police, or you will be put in detention, or, removed from the country, or, when they have children, they're told you won't be able to see your children. And so, yeah, I think these are the many ways in which immigration control makes them more vulnerable.
Can you tell me a little bit about how coercive control operates in trafficking scenarios that resemble domestic relationships? Things like cases of forced marriage or domestic servitude.
So I think this goes back to the previous answer a bit, because they can be sort of two sides of the same coin in cases where the survivor is a migrant. Because coercive control is about power, and it's about preventing a victim from escaping, from leaving, from seeking help. But it's done through, I guess the abuse is a lot less visible. right? It's about intimidation, about isolation, manipulation, very often emotional blackmail when it's a romantic relationship or a family relationship. And it's about threats. And that's what brings us back to immigration control, because when your status is dependent on someone else, or when you don't have a legal status, then you just have no alternatives. You're in the hands of whoever is exploiting you or abusing you.
How does the failure to recognise trafficking within domestic abuse cases affect access to justice and protection for migrant women?
The main issue with this, I would say, is that when you're a victim of exploitation, trafficking, modern slavery, you have one more avenue to pursue to get support, which is the NRM, the National Referral Mechanism. And that's the framework that the government has to recognize and support victims of trafficking and modern slavery. That includes things like access to housing, access to a bit of money, access to an interpreter, access to legal advice. These are all really important things for someone who is seeking safety, and also gives you access to a support worker who will sort of coordinate all of this with you and who will do, the risk assessment and the needs assessment that you need. And so if whoever is advising you or supporting you doesn't recognize that this is an option for you, then that's just an avenue that is closed off for you, and that can be really vital for many women.
In your experience, what role do cultural norms and community pressure play in silencing women who are being exploited by, say, family or intimate partners? And do you think this is well understood in the UK?
I would say a huge role. In particular, I think in silencing women when they're experiencing abuse or exploitation. I think for women especially, but women of certain cultures even more, there's sort of values to uphold, there's family reputation, there's duty, and all of these things can lead women to tolerate abuse. We've seen, community leaders and even religious leaders who play a huge part in this as well. We've had cases here at LAWRS where the woman, was experiencing abuse, but either the priest or the pastor is telling them, don't leave, he will make an effort, or don't leave, you have a duty to your family, you have children, you need to have a united family. I think all of this plays a huge part in keeping women down and accepting their situation rather than seeking support. Another issue here, I think, is that all of these things, of course, tend to happen behind closed doors. So they aren't that easy to identify, and very often when someone does identify them, they think, well, it's a private matter, I shouldn't interfere, I shouldn't get involved. And then that can make women believe, or survivors believe, that no one will be there to help them because no one has offered them that help that they might need. And in terms of it being understood in the UK, I think I would say probably not as well as it should be. I think all the support systems in the UK are quite sort of Western culture based, and probably not taking into consideration all of these things in the way that they should.
And do you think the current domestic abuse frameworks in the UK adequately account for the experiences of exploitation that migrant women specifically face?
I would say absolutely not. I think the Domestic Abuse Act is the perfect example of how this doesn't work, because it sets out, a lot of great support that if you are undocumented or if you have no recourse to public funds, you won't really have access to any of it, or you will find it very hard to have that access. And the hostile environment that we're in, which all the frameworks are a part of, means that practices like data sharing between services like the police or local authorities or other statutory services with immigration enforcement lead many migrant victims to not be willing to come forward, not be willing to report, because they're just too scared, they're too afraid. Because at the moment, there's no guarantee, if you go to the police to report a crime, that your data will not be shared with immigration enforcement. That's why at LAWRS we have been campaigning for years for women to have safe reporting mechanisms and for there to be a firewall between the police and other services and immigration enforcement, so that women can report safely and not put themselves or others at risk as well. there's other barriers as well that these frameworks don't necessarily, or they are taken into account, but they aren't tackled, I suppose. One of them is the language barrier, for example. We see time and time and again at LAWRS how women aren't given interpreters, even by services that are obliged to do so under the Equality Act. Another issue I think is that many migrant women come to community organizations for support that they can't really access in mainstream organizations or through the government directly. And of course, by and for organizations are profoundly and chronically underfunded, which means that we can't offer all the help that we would want to give to everyone that we would want to support.
With that in mind, what examples, if any, have you seen where, let's say, the safeguarding systems in this country have failed to identify a woman as a victim of both domestic abuse and trafficking? What should have been done differently?
I think I'm going to start with the positives and say that I'm lucky to work with an amazing team here at LAWRS. And I can say that when a service user comes to any of our services, if there are any indicators that she might be experiencing abuse or trafficking or exploitation, that is immediately picked up, and we make sure that that person receives the support that they need, or that at least they know what all their options are, because it will of course be up to them the kind of support that they want to get. So I'm very lucky in that way. We have, however, seen cases where I would say mostly the police have failed to recognize victims of modern slavery or trafficking. That is very common. I would say many of them don't even know that they have a role as first responders, that they should be referring women into the NRM or explaining what the NRM is and how they can access that support. And we've even had cases where a victim or a survivor has gone to the police has explained to them what the NRM is, but then nothing was ever done, even though the woman did want to go into the NRM. It was months after that they came to LAWRS that we went ahead with that referral into the NRM. What should have been different in those cases is, first, there needs to be better training for statutory services, because we see this so often with the police and local authorities that they don't understand their role. They don't know how to identify modern slavery. And that needs to be ongoing, of course, because you get new people coming into these jobs all the time. Without that training, that isn't going to change. It's important, I think, as well, that these agencies start working more closely with community organizations, because these are the organizations that women trust and that women feel safe going to. And they might not want to be referred into the NRM, for example, through the police, but they might want to do it through us because they think that it's a safer option in any way.
To end, I wonder, what forms of resistance or resilience have you witnessed amongst the women navigating these overlapping harms?
I think, to be honest, the mere act of existing in this country and resisting this very hostile frameworks and very hostile agencies and very hostile system in general is an act of resilience. We have seen women organize and try and change things. We have seen women who are service users, get involved in our policy work. We love it when that happens. We're very sort of careful not to be tokenistic in that. We're very, very careful in the way we, for example, expose vulnerable survivors to reporters, but we try as much as we can to give the survivors that chance to do something more if they want. And I think something else mentioned is that many of us at LAWRS have experienced these things that we're working with, be it big domestic abuse or be it, poverty or issues when you arrive to this country and you end up in these three sectors, either cleaning, hospitality, or domestic work, that you find it really hard to get out of. So many of the women who are working at LAWRS have been in these situations, and I think we are all in a way inspired by each other, by the journeys that we've had, the journeys that we've all had as migrants, because we're all migrants here as well. And I think this goes back to the first or second questions, but working with our own community and for our own community, I think sort of keeps us all going.